What if you were sentenced to death, only to be completely cleared, and then decades later dragged back into court, this time by the U.S. military, and condemned again for the exact same crime? That's not the plot of a legal thriller. It's the true story of Timothy Hennis, a man caught between life and death, innocence and guilt, freedom and the relentless grip of a justice system that refused to let go. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about the dark power of loopholes, the evolution of forensic science, and one man's journey through 3 trials for the same brutal crime, each with a completely different ending. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. If you're into shocking trials, twisted killers, and courtroom chaos, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what comes next. Fayetteville, North Carolina, May 1985. To outsiders, the Eastburns looked like your typical all-American military family. Captain Gary Eastburn, an officer in the U.S. Air Force, was away in Alabama for advanced training. His wife, Katie Eastburn, a 31-year-old mother of 3, was holding down the fort at home with their daughters, Kara, age 5, Erin, age 3, and little Jana, not even 2 years old. They lived just outside Pope Air Force Base in a quiet suburban home. But behind the scenes, the Eastburns were preparing for a big change. Gary had been assigned to a new position with the Royal Air Force in England. The whole family would be moving overseas within weeks. In the midst of the chaos of relocation, Katie had to figure out what to do with the family dog, a beautiful English setter named Dixie. She placed a classified ad in a local paper called Beeline Grab, Bragg, offering to give the dog away to a good home. It was a simple act, an innocent ad, but it set off a chain of events that would end in unimaginable horror. On May 7th, a young Army sergeant named Timothy Hennis showed up at the Eastburn residence. He was responding to the dog ad. Hennis, who lived nearby at Fort Bragg, had a wife and a baby daughter. He claimed they wanted a dog, and Katie welcomed him inside. Hennis chatted with Katie, picked up Dixie, and left. According to him, that was the last time he ever saw her. Just a few days later, Katie stopped answering her husband's calls. By May 12th, after repeated failed attempts to reach her, a neighbor grew concerned and entered the house with a local police officer. What they found inside was beyond disturbing. Katie Eastburn and her 2 oldest daughters had been brutally murdered. Katie had been sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly. Her body lay in the master bedroom, stripped from the waist up, a scene of carnage and rage. 5-year-old Kara was stabbed in the chest multiple times. 3-year-old Erin was found nearby, beaten so severely that the pattern of her injuries suggested she'd been struck in the back and chest with a blunt object. The youngest child, Jana, had somehow survived. Alone, dehydrated, and covered in her own waste, she'd been in the house with the bodies for days. The town of Fayetteville was stunned. A military family, targeted and destroyed in the sanctuary of their own home. No signs of forced entry, no clear motive, just death and a city on edge. The investigation began immediately. Detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office took charge. Inside the Eastburn home, they found partial fingerprints, strands of hair, and most ominously, evidence of a failed cleanup attempt. Luminol tests revealed bloody streaks on the walls and floors. Someone had tried to erase the nightmare, but only halfway. Several items were missing from the Eastburn home. Katie's ATM card, an envelope of cash, and a small paper that listed her ATM PIN. The killer hadn't just slaughtered a family, he'd stolen from them too. Then came the tip that changed everything. On the very first night of the investigation, a janitor named Patrick Cohn approached detectives. He said he saw something strange in the early morning hours of May 10th. A tall white man wearing a knit cap, jeans, and a black members-only jacket was walking out of the Eastburn's driveway carrying a large plastic trash bag. He said the man drove off in a white Chevrolet Chevette. The description was solid enough to create a police sketch, which soon ran in local media. That same week, Timothy Hennis walked into the police station voluntarily. He said he had heard the news and wanted to clear his name. After all, he had visited the Eastburn home to pick up the dog. He figured the police might want to talk. That may have been a mistake. Hennis told detectives he'd only interacted with Katie once, on May 7th, when he picked up Dixie. He claimed he called her again briefly on May 9th to update her on how the dog was doing, but otherwise hadn't seen or spoken to her again. He also had an alibi. On the night of May 9th, he said he drove his wife and daughter to her parents' house, then went home after stopping for gas. But the police weren't buying it. First, his physical appearance was a near-perfect match for the composite sketch. Second, the eyewitness, Patrick Cohn, picked him out in a photo lineup. Third, the timing didn't quite add up. His former girlfriend, Nancy Mazur, told detectives Hennis had shown up at her house unexpectedly on the same night he claimed to be home alone. Then came even more red flags. Detectives learned that Katie's ATM card had been used twice after her death, once on May 10th and again early on May 11th. The total withdrawn? $200. And guess who had just been late on his rent and had a history of writing bad checks? You guessed it, Timothy Hennis. A woman who used the ATM shortly after the second withdrawal described seeing a blond man, tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket. It sounded eerily like Hennis. To top it off, Hennis had dropped off a black members-only jacket at a dry cleaner on May 10th, just hours after the suspected time of the killings. Even more suspicious, neighbors said he saw him burning items in a barrel behind his house the very next day. With mounting circumstantial evidence and a witness ID, police arrested Timothy Hennis on May 15, 1985. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree rape. But as shocking as the arrest was, the trial that followed would be even more explosive. Hennis's trial began in the summer of 1986 in Cumberland County. It was a media circus, with journalists packing the courtroom and locals debating his guilt daily. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They claimed Hennis had seen Katie alone and vulnerable when he came to pick up the dog, that he was infatuated, possibly obsessed, that he returned a few nights later, on May 9th, hoping to seduce her. But when she rejected him, prosecutors said he snapped. They argued he raped Katie, then murdered her in a fit of rage, then turned his violence on the children to eliminate witnesses. The prosecution leaned hard on the timeline, the ATM withdrawals, and Cohn's eyewitness testimony. They also reminded the jury that Hennis had cleaned and burned potential evidence. His jacket, dry cleaned. The trash, burned. To seal their case, the prosecution showed the jury graphic crime scene photos. Katie's lifeless body, the stab wounds, the children's injuries. Jurors were visibly shaken. One even reportedly cried. After 10 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Guilty on all counts. On July 8, 1986, Timothy Hennis was sentenced to death. That same day, an anonymous letter was mailed to both Hennis and the sheriff's office. It read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." No return address, no fingerprints, nothing to prove it was real. To the public, it seemed like a hoax. To Hennis, it was a taunt from someone who might have gotten away with murder. But it wouldn't be the last twist in this case. While Hennis sat on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, his legal team went to work. Led by attorney Gerald Beaver, the defense appealed the conviction on one major point, that the graphic crime scene photos shown in court had unduly prejudiced the jury. They argued the images were so gruesome, so emotionally manipulative, that they made a fair trial impossible. In April 1989, Timothy Hennis returned to court. This time the defense came loaded with counterattacks. They discredited Patrick Cohn, pointing out his criminal behavior since the first trial, including multiple thefts and arrests. They also challenged the weather he claimed to have witnessed the suspect in. Cohn said it was clear, but meteorological experts said it was overcast and rainy. The female ATM witness? Her story had changed between interviews. At first, she couldn't positively identify Hennis. Then, days before the trial, she said it was him. The defense introduced new witnesses too. A teenager who was jogging near the Eastburn home that night and looked eerily similar to Hennis. A newspaper delivery woman who saw a different man with long hair near the house. They also presented evidence that several hairs, blood samples, and even footprints at the crime scene didn't match Hennis or the victims. And in a bold move, Hennis took the stand himself. For 3 weeks, the court listened, watched, and reconsidered the man they once sentenced to die. This time the jury came back with a different verdict. Not guilty. Timothy Hennis walked free in April 1989. He returned to his family, re-enlisted in the U.S. Army, and began the process of rebuilding his life. But the story was far from over, because what no one knew then was that the deadliest blow was still waiting. In 2010, more than 20 years after the original crime, Timothy Hennis once again found himself in a courtroom, but this time it was different. This wasn't a civilian trial. This time it was the United States Army that had unfinished business with him. Hennis had retired honorably in 2004, but the military hadn't forgotten. Because he was technically still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, they recalled him to active duty, not to serve the country, but to face court-martial for the Eastburn murders. That's right, after being acquitted in 1989, Hennis was now facing a third trial, and this one had teeth. And the evidence that doomed him? The DNA. The very same semen sample taken in 1985 was retested in the early 2000s using new technology. It matched only Hennis, no room for error. No ambiguous fingerprints. This was biological proof, and it hit like a freight train. In court, the prosecution was ruthless. They laid out the brutal nature of the crime again, showing crime scene photos, recounting Michelle's desperate attempts to protect her daughters, and emphasizing the indisputable DNA match. Hennis's defense tried to punch holes in the timeline. They argued contamination, mishandling of evidence, and alternative suspects. But it was a hard sell. In 2010, juries believed DNA the way people once believed a signed confession. It was the gold standard. And on April 8, 2010, the verdict was handed down. Guilty. A military panel sentenced Master Sergeant Timothy Hennis to death. The twist? This was a federal military trial, and the state of North Carolina had already abolished capital punishment in practice. But the military, it still had the death penalty. It was a stunning conclusion to a case that had already seen one man convicted, then exonerated, only to be condemned again years later. Hennis was now sitting on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the few inmates in modern U.S. history to be sentenced to death by a military court. And just like that, a man who once walked free became one of the most controversial inmates on death row. But the questions didn't end there. The 2010 conviction sent shockwaves across the legal world, not just because Hennis had been convicted again, but how it happened. To many, it looked like a blatant violation of double jeopardy protections. After all, wasn't he already acquitted back in 1989? The loophole? Dual sovereignty. Under U.S. law, separate sovereigns, like the state of North Carolina and the U.S. military, can each prosecute the same crime. It's rare, and usually only used in extreme cases. But in Hennis's case, it was weaponized in full. Civilian courts had cleared him, but the Army argued it had independent jurisdiction, especially since Hennis had been an active-duty soldier at the time of the murders. It was enough to legally bring him back to trial. Whether it was ethical or not was a different story. Legal scholars were split. Some called it a necessary use of military justice, pointing to the strength of the DNA evidence. Others argued it set a dangerous precedent, one where a person could be hunted down by any court that didn't like the outcome of a trial. And then there were the public reactions. Some people celebrated the conviction. They saw Hennis as a brutal killer who had finally been brought to justice. Others saw it as a terrifying abuse of power. A man tried 3 times for the same crime, with the government bending the rules to get the result it wanted. What made it even murkier was that no new evidence beyond the DNA was ever presented. There were no new eyewitnesses, no confession, just a sample collected over 25 years earlier. Had the system corrected a historic wrong, or created a new one? Either way, the damage was done. And the Eastburn family? They had lived with this nightmare for decades. Now they could finally close the book. Or so they hoped. Today, Timothy Hennis sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, one of the most secure military prisons in the world. But here's the thing. No U.S. military execution has taken place since 1961. The death penalty exists on paper, but in practice, it's a ghost. President George W. Bush approved Hennis's execution in 2010, but no date has ever been set. So Hennis sits and waits. He's still allowed visits. He's still considered a prisoner under military law. But there's no parole, no appeals left that could overturn the conviction. His fate now rests in the hands of history. Occasionally, his case makes waves online. Reddit threads, true crime podcasts, legal forums. People are still trying to unpack it. Was he guilty? Did the military cheat the Constitution? Or did justice finally catch up to a killer who slipped through the cracks? His name comes up every time people debate DNA's role in courtrooms. Every time someone argues the fairness of dual sovereignty. Every time a wrongful conviction is brought up. He's a ghost that won't go away, either as a victim of government overreach or as a monster finally exposed. And somewhere out there, the Eastburn family still carries the scars. One brutal night, 3 lives lost, and a legal saga that outlived them all. The case of Timothy Hennis reads like a legal thriller. 3 trials, 1 man, a DNA twist decades later, and a conviction that sparked national debate. At the center of it all is a simple, painful question. Did he do it? If he didn't, then the government bent the rules to execute an innocent man. If he did, then the system let a killer walk free for over 20 years. It's a lose-lose for faith in justice, either way. Hennis's story isn't just about murder. It's about the fragility of truth, the power of new technology, and the gaps in a legal system that can try you until it gets it right. And maybe the most haunting part? We may never really know the full truth. So next time you hear about a conviction, an acquittal, or a DNA match from decades ago, remember Timothy Hennis, because sometimes justice takes the long road, and sometimes it just keeps circling back. If you were on the jury, would you have voted to convict Hennis in 2010? Drop your opinion in the comments. Want more shocking cases where the justice system got twisted? Hit the like button and subscribe to Death Row Diaries. We post deep dives just like this every week.